right? Over 750,000 people. The idea, of course, was not to kill the largest number of Palestinians. This wasn't a genocide. 13,000 Palestinians were killed, but the idea was to force the Palestinians out. And you can see it in the way that the military operations were carried out. Palestinian villages were surrounded from 3 sides usually, and they left one side open in the direction of the closest border to kick the people out. Over 530 towns and villages were depopulated and destroyed in the process. And this is the core issue, right? I think this is one of the reasons why we're having the seminar today. When we talk about the demands of the BDS movement, it's 3 demands. It's not just about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The core demand is the implementation of refugee rights, right? There's no such thing as a solution in Palestine without solving and finding a just solution based on international law for the Palestinian refugees. You'll see from this map, which is a map of the registered official UN refugee camps, the highest density of Palestinian refugees anywhere in the world is in the Gaza Strip. In the Gaza Strip today, there's 1.5 million people. Out of the 1.5 million, 1.1 million are refugees. Right? So over 2/3 of the people in Gaza are refugees. And what's interesting also is that the vast majority of these refugees live only 20 to 30 minutes away from their homes. Right? So theoretically, at least, we can solve the problem in the Gaza Strip in 20 minutes if we have enough budget. But the only reason that none of these refugees are allowed to go back is because they're not Jewish. Right? So the only reason that I'm not allowed to go to where my grandparents were expelled from is because I'm not Jewish. At best, I can go and visit it on an Israeli tourist visa, but in general, I can't go and live there. I can't go and reclaim this land. And this is the situation of 6.4 million Palestinians in the world. Out of a total Palestinian population in the world of 10.5 million. And then there's another 700,000 Palestinians who are internally displaced people. Right? So basically 7.1 million Palestinians in the world are displaced people out of a total population of 10.5 million. Right? So this is also just numerically why the refugee issue is considered the core issue. In addition to the fact that we need to defeat Zionism as a racist ideology, the vast majority of Palestinians are people who have a right to return to where they're from, where they were expelled from by the Zionist movement, and have been denied this right for the past 62 years or so. So this is just a photo of Baqa refugee camp, the largest refugee camp in Jordan from the 1950s, and this is the photo from the same place today, right? So just generation after generation. Only 20% of Palestinian refugees live in the camps though. 80% live outside of the refugee camps. Anyway, I'm going to skip some things. The period from 1948 to 1966 is where Israel created the main laws that entrenched its apartheid system. Stephanie talked about most of the main important ones, right? The law of return, the citizenship law, the laws around land and the Jewish National Fund. But what's really important to note also is that from 1948 to 1966, the Palestinians who stayed, right? There's a very small number of Palestinians, around 150,000 in 1949, who were able to remain inside what became Israel. And these Palestinians are often forgotten. They're the second demand in the BDS campaign, the demand for full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Today they number 1.2 million people. So 20% of Israel's population, 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinians. And they suffer from systematic discrimination in every aspect of their lives. And I'll give some examples now. From 1948 to 1966, these people were governed under military rule, which means Israel had 2 separate legal systems. If you were a Jewish citizen of the state, you were governed under Israel's civil law. the law that is passed by the parliament, and if you have a problem, you go to the court to solve it. But if you were a Palestinian citizen of the state, you were governed by the military commander of your district. Right? This person, always a man, so this man would issue the law. He would just write on a piece of paper, and this would become the law, as far as you're concerned. Now, there's many military laws. It's also interesting, in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, these same military laws just moved into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, right, with the same numbers. Now, there's many aspects to the military rule, but the main purpose of the military rule was further confiscation of Palestinian land and displacement of Palestinians off of this land. Right? The way that the military law was working was it restricted Palestinians to the areas where they lived, and then in some cases the Israelis actually kicked more Palestinians out from where they lived and took control over their land. But this time, now that it became a state, they would use the law for this purpose. Now, I don't know if Stephanie talked about this. In South Africa, it was very clear. You can read any of the laws, what we call the apartheid laws, and you will see the discrimination written into the law. So you read something like the Group Areas Act, and you see very clearly whites, blacks, coloreds, Indians each have separate and different rights and responsibilities and privileges. So it becomes very obvious. Israel is a little bit more sophisticated, but only a little. Like you have to scratch a little bit to see how the discrimination works. So for example, very classic example from this military rule period, the Israeli military commander, there's a military order, number 125. It enables the military commander to declare an area as a closed military zone, which means everybody in that area has to leave. And then you have another law, an old Ottoman law that Israel sort of revived, that says that if a piece of land is not cultivated, if you don't plant it and work on it for 3 years, it becomes property of the state. Right? So you get kicked off your land by the army, and you're not allowed to go back. Then the court says, you haven't planted anything for 3 years, so now this is our property. Now it becomes the property of the state. So if we read this, like if we read the laws themselves, they don't look discriminatory. They look like normal laws that you could have anywhere. But the way that they are implemented is where you find the discrimination, right? I dare you to find a Jewish family that was kicked out of their house without any kind of reparation or compensation because their house was declared a closed military zone. It doesn't exist, right? Only Palestinians have suffered this kind of thing. I'll give you another example. This is the southern half of Palestine. You can see on the top left is the Gaza Strip, on the top right is the West Bank. Before 1948, over 100,000 Palestinians lived in this area. After the 1948 Nakba, only 10 to 15,000 were able to remain. Right? So 90% of the population of this area became refugees. In the Gaza Strip, in the Sinai, in Jordan, some of them in the West Bank, and a tiny number were internally displaced further north. The 10 to 15,000 who remained were all squeezed, can you see the arrow? Yeah. Into this area up here. In Arabic we call it Mantaqat al-Siyaj, which means the fenced area. So in the 50s and 60s, the Israeli government wasn't very pleased because this was still a high-density Palestinian area. Right? So it became a priority area for, remember I said the Judaization, to transform the demographics of this area. So since the 60s until today, the Israelis have systematically tried to increase the proportion of the Jewish citizens to the Palestinian citizens in this area. Remember, these are Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel. So in 1965, Israel passed one of the most important laws for this area. By the way, the two Judaization priority areas are this area, the Negev, in Arabic the Naqab, and the Galilee, the north of Palestine. There's an Israeli ministry called the Ministry for the Development of the Negev and the Galilee. Right? So you can, and the person who was the minister of this ministry was Shimon Peres, now the president. Right? He's the father of the idea of having this ministry specifically. Right? So, but for the past 50 years or so, these have been the two priority areas. And the reason it's these two is the coast area, which is the rest of the country, in the middle, where the West Bank is, up to Akka, this was largely cleaned of its Palestinian population in 1948. Like the Ramle district and the Jaffa district, all of the villages, 100% of the villages in these districts were cleaned out. There are no Palestinian villages remaining in these areas. Okay, so in 1965, Israel passed a very important law called the Planning and Construction Law. And if we read the Planning and Construction Law, just like any other Israeli law, we won't see any discrimination. The way that the Planning and Construction Law works is it has a long list of all of the cities, towns, villages, kibbutzes, moshavs in Israel. All of the communities. And then it says here we have, residential area, agricultural area, school, archaeological site, etc. So what's interesting about the law is that dozens of Palestinian villages are just not listed in the law. Right? So all of the blue dots and green dots on this map were not listed in the law in 1965. So as soon as the law was issued in 1965, these all became illegal communities because they're not listed. So what does it mean, illegal community or unrecognized village? That you receive no electricity, no water, no roads, no sewage, no schools, no clinics. But it also means that all of the buildings in the village are illegal buildings. It's important to get a license to build if your village doesn't exist. So this is one of the unrecognized villages. It's called Wadi Naam. 6,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel live in this village. All of the houses in this village have been destroyed at least once. But what's interesting, or a little bit special about this village, even though there's no electricity in the village, no government-created